Making Sense with Mathquez is a weekly podcast where you can find tips on teaching and parenting, as well as weekly reflections based on biblical principles, or as we like to call them, chicken nuggets of wisdom. And now, your host of the show, my Poppy.
So before we get this episode started officially, I wanted to take a moment and give a shout out to my wife, Lily. Lily has been a huge supporter ever since she was in the 3rd grade. I might just devote one of these episodes to sharing a testimony about her and how we came to be we. You know what? Let's do that. Tune in next week to hear the story of how God brought us together. It's a story that I never get tired of sharing, and I'm excited to share it with you next time. So, happy first week of June. If you had the opportunity to teach in a school building this year, I wonder where you're at in the process of cleaning out your classroom. Now, if you're like me, you'll have a box of books, manuals, and other resources mixed with a few personal trinkets. I think now is the perfect time to take a moment and reevaluate some of the artifacts we use to decorate our classroom. Decorate. But we just finished taking down the decorations. Yeah, I know. And as you were removing things off of the bulletin boards and wiping down shelves, were there any particular items that seemed to say, "Don't you dare throw me away"? Maybe it was something that a student gifted you that highlights your knack for relationship building. Maybe it's a picture that your 16-year-old son drew when he was 5 that reminds you why you do this work. So here's my challenge. Find 5 of these items, these artifacts, these mementos, whatever name you'd like to assign them. Now, consider your personal values. The things that you believe are important in the way that you live and work. And I suspect that if you are like me in the first 10 years of my teaching practice, it might not even be a consideration. And that's okay. Maybe this is the perfect time to put aside thoughts on the curriculum or lay aside the uncertainty of what school will look like in the fall and consider, what are my personal values? And my follow-up question would be, how do these artifacts that adorn our classrooms reflect these values? But why? What's the point of this? How will this benefit me in September, Jeffrey? I'm going to get there. So, back in the 1950s, a man named Lawrence Kohlberg began to develop a theory about moral reasoning, essentially stating that moral reasoning has 6 developmental stages. Fun fact, I once worked at a school that posterized these stages on the wall as a reminder of possible human responses to conflict. So let's use the classic example of completing your homework. And forgive me if my examples are slightly off. You'll see what I mean. In stage 1, you do something to avoid punishment. So in other words, Joey does his homework to avoid detention. In stage 2, you do something to get a reward. Joey does his homework to earn video game time at home. Stage 3 is all about interpersonal relationships. So you do something to avoid disapproval from others or to get approval from others. In this example, Joey does his homework to please his teacher. Stage 4 features the idea of upholding a rule as the basis for decision making. So Joey does his homework because it's just another rule to follow in school. In stage 5, you start to incorporate some personal responsibility, and then there's this concept of contractual perspective. Joey recognizes he's a student and that it's his job to do his homework. Stage 6 of Kohlberg's Stages of Moral Development describes the rationale behind behavior as being guided by some moral code. So in my example, Joey does his homework because his conscience would not allow him to not do his homework. In other words, he does his homework because it's the right thing to do. So, how do we get our students to work within the realm of stages 5 and 6? In other words, how do I motivate my students to do the right thing because it's the right thing to do? Here's where my challenge comes in, and I think it'll take some modeling from you. What I mean by that is, I think our students should see how we process our decisions, see the rationale that our classroom rules are built on, and recognize our personal investment not in the rule, but in the values underneath the rules. And here's something to look forward to. These values that you have, you can strategically introduce them and revisit them throughout the year. For example, I remember one year repeatedly talking up the idea about how math class was more of a marathon than a sprint. And I used my own racing bibs as the border of a bulletin board. And I would refer to them from time to time. What about you? What are some artifacts that you would use to craft the best narrative about you and your personal values? Leave a comment down below if you're watching down on YouTube, or email me at makingsensewithmathquez@gmail.com. That's makingsensewithmathquez, all one word, at gmail.com. I look forward to hearing from you. More in just a sec. Okay, so in honor of launching this podcast on YouTube, we're giving away $25 worth of merch. Here's how it works. First off, you've got to be a subscriber to this channel. Click the like button, share this video, and post a comment below. Once this video hits 100 views, I'll randomly select one of you in the comments section. This contest will end a week from when this video airs. Welcome back to Making Sense with Mathquez. So, we recently celebrated a birthday in our family. Doing so allowed me the opportunity to fulfill the desire of our 2-year-old. What did he want? A helium-filled Paw Patrol balloon. And for a little more than 24 hours, he absolutely loved this thing. He wanted to hold it. He wanted to run around with it. He tried sitting on it, and yes, we warned him not to. But he was also fascinated with his older brother's balloon. I imagine the size of the arrangement drew him in. There were about 7 balloons tied all together, floating above our dining room table. And at times, Joseph, our 2-year-old, would let go of his balloon to ask his brothers for the other balloon. This is just one example of how fleeting Joseph's happiness is at times. He'll politely say his version of thank you when you give him something, but not long after witnessing the precious smile on his face comes a request for something else, and then something else. If I'm honest, I suppose I'm often like this myself. God will answer a specific prayer request, and when I have that thing that I was asking God for, I turn my eyes from Him onto that thing, and I realize I'm not really all that content. And so, what do? I ask for something else, and then something else, until I am reminded about what it means to have biblical joy. I kind of like how one author describes this. In an article in Christianity.com, the author defines biblical joy as, quote, choosing to respond to external circumstances with inner contentment and satisfaction because we know that God will use these experiences to accomplish His work in and through our lives, end quote. I say I kind of like this because while I believe that we ought to display contentment and satisfaction because of our knowledge of who God is, this definition lacks the perspective of our relationship with Jesus. Go with me to Psalm 16:11. Psalm 16:11, where the Bible says, "You make known to me the path of life. In your presence there is fullness of joy. At your right hand are pleasures forevermore." I propose that our joy can be measured by how much we're in God's presence. And I ask you, how obvious is it to the world around us that we are daily meeting with the King of Kings? How often are we simply satisfied in just reveling in His presence, reading, listening, and meditating on His word? I know that this is definitely an area of growth for me, especially as I turn my attention to the chaos and uncertainty that can sometimes characterize our surroundings, both in and out of the classroom. So, how are you doing at cultivating a consistent attitude of joy? How? Feel free to share in the comments down below if you're watching on YouTube. Would love to hear your thoughts. So that's all we have for this week. Until next time, thank you so much for listening. The Bible says in Proverbs 10:21, "The lips of the righteous nourish many, but fools die for lack of sense." So here I am, just a follower of Christ, trying to live out my faith and make sense of the world around us, hoping to share some nourishment every week. Now, if you appreciate this content, please do me a favor and consider subscribing and sharing this podcast with others you think would benefit from tuning in.